Over the past few weeks, we've been looking at the biopsychosocial model of mental illness. This is the lens through which we'll be analysing psychopathology throughout this course. Up until now, we've used that lens to analyse the risk factors that contribute to someone developing mental illness. Today, we're going to take a closer look at maintenance factors that keep the person depressed. We'll also be focusing on how the biopsychosocial model helps combat these factors to inform treatment options for depression. Once someone has developed depression, why does that disorder continue? Why can't depressed people just get over it and decide to be happy again? What are the biological, psychological and social factors that maintain depression, and how do therapists address these factors in treatment? Let's look at each one in turn. From a biological perspective, researchers are particularly interested in the role of serotonin, norepinephrine and dopamine. The relationship between low serotonin and depression was first described in the 1960s. At first it was thought to be a pretty simple relationship. Low serotonin equals low mood and vice versa. Research has since disproved this simplistic account. Instead, serotonin seems to regulate mood via its relationship with other neurochemicals like norepinephrine and dopamine. We won't get into the details because the biochemistry is extremely complicated, but in essence, when serotonin levels are low, these other neurochemicals become dysregulated and our mood can fluctuate wildly as a result. When pop psychology speaks colloquially about depression being caused by a chemical imbalance, this is usually what they're getting at. One of the neurotransmitters that serotonin regulates is dopamine. Dopamine plays a role in a wide range of behaviours, such as the expression of our emotions, our hunger and eating habits, our higher cognitive functions like self-regulation, impulse control, motivation and planning, and all of these can be disrupted in people with depression. Dopamine is also involved in the brain circuits that control movement, which may explain why some people with severe depression show psychomotor retardation. We also know that dopamine plays a big role in learning and reward. Chronic stress can down-regulate the dopaminergic system. When this happens, it can reduce the amount of pleasure that people feel from fun activities, and this may explain aspects of anhedonia that are so common in the disorder. Chronic stress also down-regulates the norepinephrine system. This is why serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors are sometimes prescribed to people with depression. We spoke a while ago about stress and fear and how both epinephrine and norepinephrine get released as part of the fight-flight response. When people and animals are exposed to stress over a long period of time, the body eventually can't manufacture enough norepinephrine to keep up with demand. The body gets depleted and then compensates for this by reducing the number of norepinephrine receptors that are present. I hope this story sounds a bit familiar. Think back to the foster pups of low-licking rats. Remember that these pups had fewer cortisol receptors, and this meant that those rats needed to be flooded with cortisol before the body could shut off the stress response. Well, a similar thing happens with stress and norepinephrine. You don't need to know the details of this, but down-regulation of norepinephrine is what is seen in animals who have developed learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is an effect that happens when an animal has been exposed to repeated and prolonged trauma that it cannot escape. The original experiments were horrific. Dogs were placed in an arena with a metal floor. At one end of the arena was a small barrier, and just over the other side of the barrier was a platform. Half the dogs were tethered so they couldn't escape the metal floor, whilst the other half weren't tied up so they could jump over the barrier and escape to safety. During the experiment, the metal floor was electrified, delivering painful, repeated electric shocks through the dogs' paws. The dogs that weren't tied up quickly learnt how to jump over the barrier and escape to safety, but the dogs that were tied up learnt something very different. They learnt that they were powerless. No matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get away from the pain. Over time, the dogs learnt that their punishment was inescapable, so they gave up trying. Later, when these dogs were untied and the shock was delivered again, they still didn't jump out of the arena to safety. They just stood there. The psychological effect of having no control over this awful situation had broken their will to even try. The dogs had learned that they were helpless. Later researchers found that learned helplessness disrupts norepinephrine systems in a similar way to what is seen in humans with depression. But we also know that helplessness isn't the only psychological factor in depression. There are a number of disordered thinking habits that depressed people can display. These disordered thinking habits are known as thought errors. Some of these thought errors include black and white thinking, catastrophizing, generalization, mind reading, fortune telling, and emotional reasoning. All of these are pretty self-explanatory. Black and white thinking is when someone evaluates a situation as either fantastic or terrible. There is no grey area in between. So, if a person showing black and white thinking fails an exam, they might think that life is hopeless and their career is over before it's even begun. In actuality, life is usually shades of grey. So the person didn't do well on this exam, but they could study for the next exam and get an okay outcome in the end, or they might find an entirely different career that they end up preferring. Catastrophizing and generalization are pretty similar. In both situations, the person looks at a single example and then takes it to the extreme. It rained today, so I just know it's going to rain all week. Or, I feel really depressed today, so I'll probably be depressed forever. Mind reading is where a person is convinced that other people must be thinking horrible things about them. If we think about this rationally though, this assumption is obviously a thought error. We can never know what another person is thinking, so we can never know for sure that what they're thinking is bad. Fortune telling is a bit like generalization and catastrophizing. It's the idea that you know bad things are going to happen in the future, but in this case, the person actually has zero evidence to support that idea. A person who's generalising might think, I did badly on my last exam, so I'm never going to do well again. Whereas a person who's fortune-telling would believe that they're going to do poorly on an exam, even though they're a straight-A student. People with depressive symptoms can also engage in emotional reasoning, and this is just what it sounds like. Reasoning that is based more on emotion than on reality. So, I'm feeling really anxious right now, so it must not be safe to go outside. In reality, it's just the person's mood driving their thought process. You can see how all of these thought errors would make people really upset. If you truly believe that the world is awful and the future is going to be terrible, then what hope is there? That's why it's really important to get to the heart of these thought errors, to challenge these incorrect assumptions and replace them with more realistic ones. One way that therapists do this is with cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. In CBT, a person talks through the situation with a therapist, or alternatively, they might do what's known as a behavioural experiment. In the talking therapy, the person describes the awful situation that they think is going to happen, and then together, the person and the therapist analyse the evidence for and against. If similar situations in the past weren't awful, what evidence is there that it's going to happen in the future? Just statistically, if the last exam was okay, then the next one probably will be too. In the behavioural experiment, the person jumps in at the deep end. They actually do the scary thing and then look at reality. Was that exam really as awful as they thought it was going to be? Another type of therapy that involves the person getting out and doing stuff is behavioural activation. Put simply, behavioural activation is where the person schedules and then engages in a range of activities such as hanging out with friends and family and doing exercise. And behavioural activation seems to work in a few different ways. Firstly, getting out and doing stuff prevents the person from engaging in safety behaviours. We'll talk more about safety behaviours in the context of anxiety disorders, but they're essentially the things that we do in order to avoid the things that we don't want to do. Don't want to go outside and exercise? I'm going to watch YouTube videos instead. By actually getting out and doing stuff, the person stops avoiding the world, and this in turn gives the person a sense of agency and a sense of control over their environment. We know from the learned helplessness research that this sense of control is really important. We also know that doing activities like exercise a few times a week can be just as effective as taking antidepressants. Plus, exercise has fewer negative side effects and it's better at preventing relapse. Interestingly, behavioural activation seems to work in a similar way to antidepressants by increasing levels of serotonin and dopamine. Before we move on to some of the other types of therapies, we'll just quickly talk about the 4 types of antidepressants. As we've already mentioned, SSRIs block the reuptake of serotonin so that its effect can last longer. SNRIs are similar, but they block the reuptake of both serotonin and norepinephrine. Both drugs seem to work by restricting how much the body's levels of other neurochemicals can fluctuate, and this helps to stabilise a person's mood. Before the development of SSRIs and SNRIs, the most commonly prescribed antidepressants were tricyclic antidepressants. Imipramine, which we spoke about in our History of Psychology videos, is one of these early tricyclics. They also seem to work by preventing the reuptake of certain neurochemicals, especially epinephrine, but also serotonin. The reason tricyclics have fallen out of favour is because they usually have some pretty terrible side effects like weight gain, blurred vision, constipation, difficulty urinating, and a dry mouth. I was actually prescribed a tricyclic antidepressant to help with arthritic joint pain, and my mouth tasted like I'd been drinking acetone. Blech. Although these side effects can be really difficult to cope with, many people find that they do subside in time. The final class of antidepressant is the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAO inhibitors. Just like other drugs, these increase the availability of serotonin and norepinephrine, but they work by preventing them from being broken down. Remember that the first part of the reuptake process is the neurotransmitter being broken down into its component parts. Well, MAO inhibitors prevent that breakdown process. They tend to only be used in people with depression with psychotic features, or when other treatments haven't worked. The reason being, this drug can interact with some of the chemicals present in foods like wine and cheese, and those effects can be lethal. All of the antidepressants seem to work about as well as each other, but there are always individual differences. So one person's genetics might just cause one class of drug to work better than another. Overall, about 50% of people with depression see a significant improvement in their symptoms, with about a quarter to a third of people achieving complete remission of depressive symptoms just by swallowing a tablet. For the 50% of people who don't respond, options are to try a different dose, change drugs, or to add in a second drug, and these options seem to help an additional 20 to 30% of people. Combining antidepressant therapy with other forms of therapy such as CBT or interpersonal therapies seems to help most people with depression. Interpersonal psychotherapy, or IPT, helps teach people social skills that they need to resolve problems in their interpersonal relationships. So, for example, the therapist and the client might discuss issues with their social roles. IPT helps to empower the person by addressing deficits that they may have with their social skills. The IPT then arms them with the skills that are necessary to forge new healthy relationships. Sometimes none of the conventional therapies help to alleviate the person's symptoms, and other options need to be considered. In severe cases of treatment-resistant depression where the person's life may be at risk, treatments like electroconvulsive therapy are still used. Unlike in the past, modern ECT is conducted under anaesthetic and other safety precautions are also taken. The person may still have some short-term memory loss, but this usually resolves after a couple of days. What may come as a shock, get it? Like, shock. Anyway, it's still unclear how this treatment actually works to reduce depressive symptoms. It might cause structural changes like helping new brain cells to grow, all by increasing levels of serotonin and blocking the effect of stress hormones. A less intrusive option is transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. In this therapy, an electromagnetic coil is placed on the head and a small focused pulse is delivered to that part of the brain. TMS is preferable to other techniques because the person doesn't need to be anaesthetised and the side effects are usually mild, like a headache. Unfortunately, TMS doesn't seem to work as ECT in patients with severe treatment-resistant depression or those with psychotic features. For these people, ECT can be the preferred option. Thanks for watching. In this video, we've covered some of the biological, psychological and social factors that maintain depression, as well as how different therapies for depression align with the biopsychosocial model. We looked at antidepressants, behavioural activation, and both ECT and TMS. We looked at how antidepressants, behavioural activation, and both ECT and TMS affect serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. We also looked at psychological aspects of depression, including learned helplessness and thought errors, and how these can be challenged through CBT. We also spoke about how interpersonal psychotherapy can help people with depression address some of the social difficulties that they face. Next week you'll have a break from new content. I'd like you to take this opportunity to catch up on any work that you may have fallen behind with, and also to get started on your essay if you haven't done so already. Remember that the custom textbook will help you research and write your essay, but any text that is geared towards writing in psychology will be useful for you. Finally, check your course outline so that you know exactly when your essay is due and also when the midterm exam will be held. Talk soon.